They called it a miracle of motion. But in the late summer of 1944, it began as desperation, a problem no tank shell or rifle could solve. The Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, sweeping through France like a tidal wave of steel and fire. General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing eastward, devouring the German defenses that only weeks before had seemed impregnable. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, their armored divisions shattered, their morale broken. Yet even as Patton's men advanced, their greatest enemy wasn't German. It was distance, and the relentless hunger of war machines for fuel. Every tank, every truck, every jeep, each was a thirsty beast. And the farther the Allies pushed, the longer the lifeline stretched back to the beaches of Normandy. The fuel depots were still anchored near the coast, hundreds of miles away. The French railways, wrecked by months of Allied bombing, lay twisted and useless. Pipelines were still under construction. The tanks that had smashed through hedgerows now stood still, their engines silent, their crews waiting helplessly. Patton's army, the fastest-moving formation in the West, was grinding to a halt, not from German fire, but from empty fuel cans. German intelligence noticed it first. Reports from the front described American armor paralyzed, columns of Sherman tanks abandoned in the fields. In Berlin, generals laughed. They had always sneered at American excess. The mountains of supplies, the endless convoys, the soft, mechanical warfare. Now, they believed they were seeing the truth. The Americans could move fast, but not far. Their logistics are their weakness, one German staff officer wrote. They drown in their own abundance. They didn't know that within days, that same abundance would become the engine of vengeance, an unstoppable tide of fuel and fire roaring toward the German frontier. It began with an idea, desperate, audacious, and untested. The Allied supply chiefs called it the Red Ball Express. It would be a ceaseless stream of trucks running day and night from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines in northern France, a logistical artery of pure motion designed to feed Patton's advance with gasoline, ammunition, and rations. There would be no rest stops, no detours, no hesitation. The route would be one way only, divided into two parallel roads, one for loaded trucks going forward, one for empty ones returning. Military police would clear the way, traffic lights removed, civilians banned. The Red Ball was to move like blood through the veins of an army that could not afford to stop. By August 25, 1944, the operation was underway. Nearly 6,000 trucks, mostly GMC Deuce and a half 2, 2-ton cargo haulers, began to roll out from Saint-Lô, threading their way through the rubble of Normandy toward the Seine. Painted with a red circle on the bumper, the Red Ball insignia, they became an unmistakable sight along French roads. Each truck carried up to 10 cans of fuel, hundreds of pounds of ammunition, or food for hungry divisions at the front. Their drivers, many of them African-American soldiers from segregated quartermaster units, would soon become legends of endurance and courage. They called themselves the Lifeline, and that's exactly what they were. The work was relentless. The trucks rolled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Rain turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud, while German planes, though few, still swooped down to strafe the convoys. Drivers slept in their cabs or on the ground beside their vehicles. Accidents were constant, head-on collisions, overturned loads, engines burning in the night. Some trucks never reached the front, vanishing into the chaos of war. Yet the stream never stopped. In just a few weeks, the Red Ball Express was moving 12,000 tons of supplies daily, a figure so enormous that German intelligence refused to believe it. To them, it was impossible. But impossibility was exactly what America's industrial war machine had been built to overcome. For the men behind the wheel, it wasn't strategy or glory. It was survival. They drove blind through blackout nights, their headlights taped to narrow slits, guided only by the faint glow of the truck ahead. The rumble of engines never ceased. It was a rolling thunder that echoed through the French countryside. They were warned not to stop for anything. "Keep 'em rolling" became the order of the day. Some would later remember seeing burning trucks on the roadside, hit by air raids or mechanical failure, still glowing red as they passed, a grim reminder that even logistics had its casualties. By early September, Patton's army was alive again. Fueled by the endless convoys, his tanks roared through Lorraine, slicing into the German retreat. His soldiers joked that gasoline cans were as sacred as rifles. In one incident, a forward column ran so low on fuel that they stripped it from abandoned vehicles, even German ones, just to keep moving. Patton himself understood the irony. His momentum, his very legend, depended not on the men with guns, but on the men with grease-stained hands and diesel fumes in their lungs. "My men can eat their belts," he once said, "but my tanks gotta have gas." The Red Ball Express made sure they did. The Germans began to notice. Reports came from the front of endless American columns, supply trucks swarming over bridges, flooding roads once thought impassable. The Wehrmacht had no equivalent. Their logistics, crippled by Allied bombing and shortages, relied on horse-drawn wagons and scattered fuel dumps. They could not believe the Americans were sustaining such speed across so vast a front. One captured German general, when shown the supply maps, reportedly shook his head and muttered, "It's mechanical madness." But that madness was working. Patton's Third Army advanced more than 400 miles in less than a month. Still, the success carried its own shadow. The Red Ball drivers paid a heavy price. Overworked, under-rested, and often overlooked, they operated under extreme pressure. About 75% of the personnel were African American, fighting not just the war abroad, but the prejudice within their own ranks. They were denied combat roles, but entrusted with the most vital mission of all: keeping the army alive. Many units formed their own brotherhoods, painting names and slogans on their trucks. "Hell on Wheels," "Miss Victory," "Hot Cargo." For them, each trip was a battle against fatigue, breakdowns, and the ever-present risk of death on the road. The convoys became legendary for their speed and defiance. Regulations limited the trucks to 25 miles per hour, but drivers often doubled it, hurtling down narrow lanes with engines screaming, mud splattering across the windshields. The French villagers cheered as they passed, waving flags, tossing flowers, shouting, "Vive l'Amérique!" To the soldiers, it was a brief reminder that what they were doing mattered. They weren't just driving supplies, they were driving liberation itself, mile by mile, can by can. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 100,000 tons of supplies. Entire divisions lived off its deliveries. Fuel depots sprouted closer to the front, allowing the advance to continue through the autumn rains. Yet as the Allies neared Germany, the logistical strain became unbearable. Roads choked with mud, bridges collapsed, and the front lines outpaced even the fastest convoys. Eventually, new supply systems, pipelines, railroads, and alternate truck routes took over. The Red Ball Express shut down officially in November 1944, its mission complete. It had lasted only 81 days, but in that brief window, it carried nearly 500,000 tons of war material, enough to fuel victory across an entire continent. For the German High Command, the laughter had long since stopped. Their counteroffensives, like the desperate thrust in the Ardennes that winter, found themselves crippled by the very weakness the Americans had conquered. Logistics. Where the Germans rationed every liter of fuel, the Americans could pour it by the ton. Where German columns starved on empty roads, the Allies built new ones. The Red Ball Express had revealed something deeper than ingenuity. It showed that America's strength was not only in numbers or machines, but in movement itself, a kind of momentum that no army could slow once it began. In the decades that followed, the Red Ball Express became a symbol of unheralded heroism, a reminder that wars are not won only by those who fire the shots, but by those who keep the guns loaded, the tanks moving, the armies fed. Veterans of the convoys would remember the nights of endless driving, the taste of dust and diesel, the loneliness of the road stretching endlessly ahead. They didn't appear in the victory parades or the war movies, but without them, the liberation of Europe might have ground to a halt somewhere in the fields of France. When historians trace the path of victory across Europe, they mark the battles: Normandy, Falaise, the Moselle, the Ardennes. But between those names runs an invisible line, the route of the Red Ball Express, the artery that kept the Allied heart beating. It was there, on those mud-soaked roads, that the industrial power of America met the courage of men who refused to stop. And as Patton's tanks thundered eastward, burning fuel delivered by hands that history nearly forgot, the laughter of German generals faded into silence, drowned beneath the roar of engines that would not rest until the war was won. Winter came like a hammer. The open fields of France, once alive with motion and thunder, froze into mud and fog. The Red Ball Express was gone now, its convoys dissolved into new routes, new systems. But its ghost lingered in every engine that turned, every truck that groaned eastward toward the Rhine. The war was entering its final bitter phase, and logistics remained the invisible front. By December 1944, the Allies had stretched themselves thin across a 600-mile front. The euphoria of summer had faded into exhaustion and attrition. Eisenhower's great machine was still grinding forward, but the strain was immense. Supplies had to cross shattered bridges, climb rain-soaked hills, and push through bottlenecks that turned highways into parking lots of steel. And then, just when the Allies believed victory was near, the Germans struck back. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, erupted on December 16th. Hitler's last gamble, launched in the frozen forests of Belgium, was aimed at splitting the Allied armies and seizing Antwerp. It was a masterstroke of audacity, fueled by secrecy and the last reserves of German armor. But even in that moment, the outcome hinged not just on courage, but on fuel. The Germans' plan depended on capturing Allied gasoline stocks. Without them, their tanks would die in the snow. Once again, logistics would decide the fate of nations. As the German panzers rolled west, they captured American fuel dumps by the thousands of gallons. For a brief moment, it worked. Columns of Tiger and Panther tanks surged forward, their engines roaring with stolen American fuel. But soon, the reality set in. The Germans could not sustain the pace. Allied air attacks shredded their convoys. Their own supply lines, stretched, bombed, and frozen, collapsed. The same generals who had laughed at American logistics now found their divisions stranded, their tanks immobile, their offensive dying in the snow. Meanwhile, the Americans answered with motion, the very essence of what the Red Ball Express had taught them. Emergency convoys were organized overnight, fuel rerouted across impossible terrain, trucks pressed into service from every depot. In weather so cold that engines cracked and diesel turned to wax, thousands of drivers braved the roads once more. It was not called the Red Ball anymore, but the spirit was the same. the great machine of movement, discipline, coordination, and relentless determination, ground back into motion. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held out against encirclement, supplied by a mix of airdrops and the desperate efforts of truck convoys that clawed their way through ice and artillery. When Patton's Third Army turned north to relieve them, it was again the miracle of logistics that made it possible. His tanks advanced through snowstorms and minefields, fueled by gasoline hauled across hundreds of miles. Patton himself drove his staff mercilessly, demanding speed beyond reason. He knew that in winter warfare, time was the deadliest enemy. By January 1945, the German offensive was shattered. The panzers lay scattered across the Ardennes, frozen monuments to a collapsing Reich. Allied forces resumed their push east, crossing the Siegfried Line and preparing for the assault into Germany. The Red Ball Express was gone, but its lesson had reshaped the U.S. Army. Logistics had become an art form, a weapon as decisive as any gun. Patton ES officers joked that the Army East's new motto should be first in the field, last to eat. The supply men, the drivers, the mechanics, they were the quiet victors of a war that depended on motion. When spring came, the roads turned green again. Convoys rolled east under skies now dominated by Allied aircraft. Across the Rhine, Germany was collapsing from within. Civilians wandered in ruins, fuel was measured in drops, and the Luftwaffe barely flew. The Americans moved as though gravity itself had shifted. Endless trucks, endless gasoline, endless will. The final drive through central Germany was as much a triumph of movement as of battle. In the last weeks of the war, some of the men who had driven the Red Ball Express saw the end firsthand. They crossed into a Germany they'd once only imagined. Burned towns, broken bridges, rivers filled with wreckage. They delivered fuel to units entering Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps, where the horror of what they found burned deeper than any battlefield. For them, the war ended not in glory, but in silence, the kind that follows revelation. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world celebrated the soldiers who fought, the generals who led, the nations that endured. But in quiet depots and along forgotten French roads, a different story lingered. One of motion, sweat, and sacrifice without medals. The Red Ball Express had been a logistical improvisation, born of necessity, executed with reckless determination. It was never meant to be legendary, and yet it became one of the most remarkable feats of supply in military history. After the war, historians debated its scale. Some said it symbolized American excess. Others saw it as genius born of chaos. But for those who were there, the drivers, the mechanics, the officers who lived by the clock, and the odometer, it meant something simpler. Proof that they could achieve the impossible when it mattered most. Many of the African-American veterans returned home to segregation, their heroism unacknowledged for decades. Yet their contribution had changed warfare forever. In every future conflict, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, the doctrine of mobile supply traced its roots back to those muddy French roads. Even today, old maps of the Red Ball Express are studied in military academies, not for nostalgia, but for what they reveal. That speed and strength mean nothing without sustenance. That victory belongs not just to those who fight, but to those who keep the fight moving. The Red Ball taught the world that logistics is not the shadow of war. It is its heartbeat. In the end, perhaps that's what war itself became in the 20th century, a contest not of courage alone, but of motion, endurance, and will. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, never understood it fully. The Americans, with their trucks and mechanics, their planners and drivers, mastered it. And when Patton's engines roared across France, fueled by the sweat of men who were never meant to be remembered, the laughter of German generals was replaced by a realization too late to matter. The war was being won not just on the battlefield, but on the road that led to it. The Red Ball Express, 81 days of ceaseless motion, 500,000 tons of fuel, 23,000 men, and a single mission: to keep the heart of the Allied army beating. It did. And through the smoke and the miles and the endless hum of engines, it whispered the same lesson again and again. Wars are won by those who move fastest, furthest, and refuse to stop. Even when the road ahead disappears into the night,